The splash of my fishing line barely settled when a voice behind me shouted that the police were on the way, and in that instant I knew this quiet morning was about to explode into something far bigger than a simple day at the lake. I had fished here for years, long before the manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and HOA warning signs appeared. This lake was my escape, my inheritance, and something I never imagined I would have to defend with lawyers and court filings. I was standing on the wooden dock just after sunrise, thermos in hand, enjoying the stillness, when three people in matching polo shirts approached with clipboards. They told me I was trespassing on community property and demanded I leave immediately. I calmly explained that the lake was not community-owned. It belonged to me. They laughed, wrote something down, and said they would handle it properly. Minutes later, a woman raised her phone and announced she was calling the cops. She said I was refusing to leave HOA property and acting confrontational. Neighbors gathered. Phones came out. I stayed where I was, baiting my hook, because I knew something they didn't. This lake had been deeded to my family decades before the development even existed. When the police arrived, the HOA members looked satisfied, like the ending was already written. They pointed at me and repeated their story confidently. I handed the officer a folded copy of a document I always keep in my tackle bag. His expression changed as he read. He asked for backup, not to arrest me, but to verify what he was holding. That moment marked the beginning of a legal disaster the HOA could never undo. What started as a fishing complaint would spiral into surveys, depositions, emergency board meetings, and a lawsuit so massive it threatened the entire development. The number attached to their mistake would eventually reach $8.2 million, but standing there that morning, none of them could see it coming. They thought rules were stronger than deeds. They believed authority came from signs and fines. And they had no idea that by calling the cops, they had just pulled the first thread on a story that would unravel everything they thought they owned, controlled, and understood. Standing there, rod in hand, I realized the real fight had just begun, not over fish or access, but over truth, ownership, and the dangerous confidence of people who never checked facts. The calm lake reflected the sky, unaware it would soon witness hearings, headlines, and consequences that would reshape every shoreline rule they trusted. What followed would shock everyone watching that morning. The police cars rolled in slowly, crunching gravel as they stopped near the dock, and the HOA representatives straightened their shoulders like they had just won. Two officers stepped out, calm and professional, immediately met by a flood of explanations from the HOA board members. They spoke over one another, pointing at me, insisting I was illegally fishing on community property and refusing to comply with HOA rules. According to them, this lake belonged to every homeowner equally, and I was just another resident who thought the rules didn't apply. I waited. Years of experience had taught me that truth doesn't need to rush. One of the officers finally turned to me and asked if I had anything to say. I nodded and handed him the folded paperwork I carried for moments exactly like this. It was a certified copy of the original property deed, yellowed at the edges, but legally solid. The officer read it once, then again, slower. His expression shifted from routine to cautious. He asked where I got it. I told him the truth. The lake had been part of my family's land long before the HOA existed. When the development was built, the lake was never transferred, sold, or shared. It remained mine. The officers stepped aside to talk quietly. The HOA members grew impatient, insisting the police enforce the rules immediately. One board member even threatened fines and legal action right there, confident intimidation would work. Instead, the officers returned with a different tone. They explained that this was no longer a trespassing issue. It was a civil property dispute, and based on the document provided, I had a legitimate ownership claim. That's when the mood changed. The HOA representatives went from smug to defensive in seconds. They demanded proof, surveys, maps, anything to challenge what they were hearing. One of the officers suggested they consult their legal counsel before taking further action. Another quietly warned them that continuing harassment could backfire badly. Neighbors who had gathered to watch started whispering. Some looked confused. Others looked nervous. The idea that the lake might not be community-owned was clearly news to them. I could almost see the realization spreading, homeowner by homeowner, that something fundamental had been misunderstood for years. Before leaving, the officers made one thing very clear. I was not breaking the law. I was free to fish. And any further interference would need to go through civil court, not police enforcement. The HOA members stood there, stunned, as the squad cars pulled away. I cast my line back into the water, but the piece was gone. I knew this wasn't over. Calling the cops had been their first move, and now they were cornered. When authority fails, organizations turn to lawyers, and I could already sense the legal storm forming beyond the calm surface of the lake. That single interaction had shifted everything. The HOA had exposed its ignorance, and worse, its arrogance. And in doing so, they had set themselves on a path that would cost them far more than they ever imagined, in money, reputation, and trust. By the next morning, the lake felt different. The water was the same, the dock unchanged, but the tension hung in the air like fog that refused to lift. I knew the police visit hadn't ended anything. It had embarrassed the HOA, and embarrassed organizations don't back off quietly. They regroup. They justify. They escalate. Within 48 hours, I received my first official letter. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request for clarification. It was a formal notice from the HOA accusing me of violating community rules, interfering with shared amenities, and damaging property values. They demanded I stop fishing immediately and threatened fines if I didn't comply. I read it twice, then laughed out loud. They were pretending the deed didn't exist. I responded the same way I always had, with documentation. My attorney sent them copies of the original land records, historical surveys, and county filings clearly outlining the lake boundaries. Every page told the same story. The lake was excluded from the HOA charter. It was private property. Mine. Their reply came fast and aggressive. The HOA claimed the documents were outdated. They argued that implied community use over the years gave them control. They even accused me of acting in bad faith by not informing residents earlier. That part almost impressed me. They weren't just ignoring the facts anymore. They were rewriting history. Next came the warnings posted around the lake. New signs appeared overnight claiming the water was a community amenity. Neighbors began asking questions. Some were angry. Others were confused. A few quietly apologized for assuming the HOA was right. I stayed calm and let the paperwork speak for itself. Then the harassment started. HOA security parked near my dock daily. Board members photographed me whenever I fished. I received violation notices for things unrelated to the lake, clearly meant to pressure me. That's when my attorney advised me to stop responding casually and start documenting everything. What they were doing was no longer a disagreement. It was a pattern. The HOA called emergency board meetings. Rumors spread that they were planning to sue me to force a transfer of the lake. That idea alone showed how disconnected they were from reality. You don't force someone to give up property because it's inconvenient to your narrative. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. Title insurance companies were getting involved. Lenders started asking questions. Homeowners began realizing that if the HOA was wrong about the lake, they might be wrong about other things too. Confidence cracked. Trust wavered. The lake had become more than water and fish. It was now proof. Proof that authority without verification is dangerous. Proof that assumptions can be expensive. And proof that the HOA's biggest mistake wasn't calling the cops. It was refusing to stop once they knew they were wrong. From that moment on, this was no longer about fishing. It was about accountability, and the consequences were only beginning to surface. By the time the HOA's lawyers entered the picture, the dispute had officially crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. This was no longer a neighborhood disagreement or a misunderstanding about rules. It was a legal confrontation, and everyone involved suddenly realized the stakes were much higher than a man fishing off a dock. The HOA filed their lawsuit quietly, likely hoping to intimidate me into settling. They claimed the lake had become a de facto community asset through years of shared use and that my actions interfered with homeowners' rights. Reading the filing felt surreal. They weren't just wrong. They were confident while being wrong, which is always the most dangerous combination. My legal team responded immediately. We countered with certified deeds, county plats, historical tax records, and sworn statements from surveyors dating back decades. The lake had never been transferred, never been easement granted, and never included in the HOA's governing documents. Not accidentally. Not implicitly. Never. As discovery began, things unraveled quickly for them. Emails surfaced showing that at least 2 previous HOA boards had been warned about the lake's ownership years earlier and chose to ignore it. Meeting minutes revealed internal discussions about asserting control anyway to avoid upsetting residents. That single choice turned a mistake into liability. Depositions were brutal. Board members contradicted each other under oath. One admitted they never reviewed the original development plans. Another confessed they assumed the lake was communal because it looked like one. That assumption, spoken on record, would later be quoted everywhere. You could feel the case tilting. Meanwhile, homeowners started paying attention. Legal notices went out. Insurance providers requested clarification. Title companies paused transactions. Buyers backed out. Sellers panicked. The HOA tried to reassure everyone that things were under control, but lawsuits have a way of exposing cracks no newsletter can hide. The lake was now a symbol. To me, it was proof of ownership. To the HOA, it was a liability they couldn't explain away. To the homeowners, it was a risk they never signed up for. The water hadn't changed, but its meaning had. As hearings piled up, the judge made one thing clear. This case wasn't about access. It was about governance failure. The HOA had acted without authority, ignored warnings, and escalated instead of correcting course. That mattered. Every motion they filed dug the hole deeper. Every attempt to control the narrative introduced new evidence against them. The legal fees mounted. The stress spread. And behind closed doors, discussions began about something they never imagined when they called the cops. Settlement. But at this point, it wasn't just about compensation. It was about consequences. The lake had pulled the truth to the surface, and it wasn't going back down quietly. What started as a fishing complaint was now threatening the very structure of the HOA itself, and the number attached to that risk was climbing fast. By the time settlement talks were mentioned for the first time, the damage was already spreading far beyond the lake itself. What the HOA still didn't fully understand was that this case wasn't just about me anymore. It had become a financial and legal nightmare for the entire development, and there was no quiet way out. During discovery, my legal team uncovered something critical. The HOA's insurance policy specifically excluded coverage for intentional acts taken with knowledge of disputed ownership. In simple terms, once they were warned about the lake and chose to push forward anyway, they were on their own. No insurance safety net. No backup plan. Every legal bill, every potential payout, every consequence would come directly from HOA funds. That realization sent shockwaves through the board. Emergency meetings were called. Dues increases were discussed. Special assessments were floated. Homeowners began demanding answers, and for the first time, the board couldn't hide behind vague language or confident emails. People wanted to know why they were being dragged into a lawsuit over a lake they never owned. Then the property values started to wobble. Real estate disclosures now had to mention an ongoing ownership dispute involving a major feature of the neighborhood. Buyers hesitated. Deals fell through. Lenders required additional documentation. Title companies flagged the HOA as a risk. Every stalled sale translated into angry residents and louder questions. Meanwhile, the harassment evidence we documented became its own problem. The judge allowed it into the case as proof of bad faith. The photos. The violation notices. The security presence. All of it painted a picture of an HOA trying to bully a private landowner into submission. That image stuck. Settlement numbers began circulating quietly. At first, they were low, almost insulting. My attorneys rejected them without counter-offers. As weeks passed and costs mounted, the numbers climbed. Each new figure reflected growing panic rather than reason. Behind closed doors, board members began turning on each other. Emails surfaced blaming former leadership. Accusations flew about who ignored which warning and when. One member resigned. Another hired personal legal counsel. The unity they once projected crumbled under pressure. The lake, calm as ever, watched it all unfold. At this point, the HOA's biggest mistake wasn't calling the cops. It wasn't even filing the lawsuit. It was refusing to stop once the truth was undeniable. Every step forward after that multiplied the consequences. Every delay added a zero. Experts were brought in to calculate damages. Legal fees. Lost property value. Emotional distress. Harassment. Governance failures. When the final estimates were compiled, the total exposure stunned even seasoned attorneys. $8.2 million. That number wasn't a punishment. It was a calculation. A reflection of compounded errors, ignored facts, and arrogance dressed up as authority. The HOA had crossed from being wrong into being reckless, and now the bill was due. As settlement talks stalled again, one truth became unavoidable. No matter how this ended, the HOA would never recover from it quietly. The lake had changed everything. The moment the $8.2 million figure entered the conversation, everything changed. Until then, the HOA board had treated the lawsuit like a problem they could outmaneuver, delay, or quietly settle. But numbers like that don't scare easily. They force reality into the room. The estimate wasn't pulled from thin air. It came from forensic accountants, real estate experts, and legal analysts who broke the damage down piece by piece. There were direct legal costs from years of litigation. There were losses tied to frozen home sales and reduced property values. There were penalties connected to harassment, bad faith governance, and intentional overreach. And there were future costs, the kind that don't disappear just because a lawsuit ends. Once homeowners learned the scale of exposure, panic set in. Emergency meetings filled the clubhouse. People demanded to know how a fishing dispute turned into a multi-million-dollar threat. Board members struggled to answer without admitting what discovery had already revealed. They knew there was a problem and chose to ignore it. That admission, even when carefully worded, shattered trust. Several homeowners hired independent attorneys. Others contacted local media. Questions began circulating online about the HOA's leadership, finances, and authority. Suddenly, the board wasn't just fighting me. They were fighting their own community. The judge overseeing the case made another critical ruling around this time. He allowed evidence showing the HOA continued enforcement actions after being formally warned of disputed ownership. That single decision opened the door to punitive damages. What had been expensive was now potentially devastating. Settlement talks resumed, but the tone was different. The HOA wasn't negotiating from confidence anymore. They were negotiating from fear. Offers were made. Deadlines were requested. Extensions were begged for. My legal team stayed calm and methodical. We weren't interested in dragging things out, but we also weren't interested in rescuing them from their own choices. Behind the scenes, something else was happening. the HOA's reserve funds were quietly being drained by legal bills. Insurance providers formally denied coverage. Auditors flagged governance failures. Lenders grew uneasy. The financial structure holding the HOA together began to creak under the weight of its own mistakes. Meanwhile, I kept fishing. Not out of spite, but out of principle. Every cast was a reminder that facts matter. Ownership matters. And confidence without verification is a dangerous thing. What began as a call to police had now triggered financial consequences that threatened the HOA's survival. The board had lost control of the narrative, the numbers, and the community's trust. And as the pressure mounted, one final decision loomed ahead, one that would define how this story ended. They could accept responsibility. Or they could make it even worse. By the time the HOA realized they could no longer control the situation, the damage wasn't just financial. It was structural. The organization was cracking from the inside, and everyone could see it. Meetings that once lasted an hour now dragged on for entire evenings, filled with raised voices, accusations, and residents demanding answers the board couldn't give. Board members began resigning. The first resignation was framed as personal reasons, but no one believed it. Within weeks, 2 more followed. One board member openly admitted during a meeting that they had warned others years ago about the lake's ownership and were ignored. That statement made its way into official minutes, then into the lawsuit. Another mistake added to a growing pile. Homeowners were furious. They weren't just upset about the potential $8.2 million loss. They were angry that their dues had been used to fund harassment, intimidation, and a lawsuit the HOA never had the right to file. Special assessments were proposed to cover legal costs, and that's when things truly exploded. People refused to pay. Some homeowners stopped contributing altogether, choosing to escrow their dues until leadership changed. Others demanded a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances. Rumors spread about mismanagement, selective enforcement, and other disputes that had been quietly buried over the years. The lake had opened a door no one could close. The judge ordered mediation, hoping to avoid a full trial. By this point, the HOA's legal team had changed twice. Each new firm inherited a mess they didn't create and quietly urged settlement. But settling wasn't simple anymore. Too many parties were involved. Too many mistakes had been documented. During mediation, the HOA's representatives finally acknowledged what they had avoided saying out loud. They never owned the lake. They never had the authority they claimed. And once they knew that, they should have stopped. That admission changed everything. Punitive damages were now firmly on the table. The court recognized a pattern of willful misconduct, not confusion. The HOA wasn't just wrong. It had acted knowingly, repeatedly, and aggressively. That distinction mattered. Meanwhile, homeowners began voting with their feet. Houses went up for sale. Others sat empty, unsellable due to the ongoing litigation. Property values dipped further, compounding the losses. What had once been a selling point, a beautiful lake at the center of the community, had become a symbol of dysfunction. I watched all of this from a distance. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't engage in arguments. I let the facts do their work. The truth had momentum now, and it didn't need my help. The HOA had tried to assert power where it had none. In doing so, it exposed every weakness it had been hiding. Authority without legitimacy doesn't just fail. It collapses. And as the final court dates approached, one thing became clear to everyone involved. This case was no longer about stopping me from fishing. It was about whether the HOA itself would survive what it had unleashed. The final hearing didn't look dramatic from the outside. No shouting crowds. No flashing cameras. Just a courtroom filled with binders, tired attorneys, and people who knew their future was about to be decided by documents they had ignored for years. This was the moment where opinions stopped mattering and records took over. The judge didn't rush. He went through the history carefully. The original land deed. The county plats. The HOAs governing documents. The meeting minutes where warnings were discussed and dismissed. The emails where board members admitted they knew the lake might not belong to them but chose to push forward anyway. Each piece fit together like a picture no one could unsee. What stood out most wasn't a single mistake. It was the pattern. The HOA hadn't acted once in error. They had acted repeatedly, after being warned, after being corrected, and after involving law enforcement without authority. The judge made it clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was willful overreach. When the ruling came, it was precise and devastating. The lake was declared private property beyond dispute. The HOA was permanently barred from claiming, regulating, or representing it as a community asset. All enforcement actions taken against me were ruled invalid. But that was only the beginning. The court found the HOA liable for damages tied to harassment, loss of property value, legal expenses, and governance failures. The final number matched what experts had warned about from the start. $8.2 million. The courtroom went silent. Some homeowners put their heads in their hands. Former board members stared straight ahead, expressionless. Attorneys began whispering urgently. The judge wasn't finished. He ordered mandatory restructuring of the HOA's leadership, external financial oversight, and a full audit. The organization that once believed it controlled everything was now under supervision. Outside the courtroom, reality set in fast. News traveled quickly. Local media picked it up. Buyers pulled listings. Lenders tightened requirements. The HOA's reputation collapsed almost overnight. What had been marketed as a well-managed community was now a case study in how not to govern. I walked out quietly. There was no celebration. No victory speech. Just relief. Relief that truth had finally been recognized in a place where it mattered. Relief that facts, not confidence, had won. The lake didn't look any different when I returned. The water still moved gently. The dock still creaked under my boots. But everything around it had changed. Rules had fallen. Assumptions had shattered. And an organization that mistook authority for ownership had paid the price. There was only one chapter left in this story now, and it wasn't about courts or money. It was about what this all meant, long after the paperwork was signed and the headlines faded. In the weeks after the ruling, life slowly returned to the lake, but nothing around it felt the same. The water was still calm. The fish still bit at sunrise. Yet the community surrounding it carried a quiet awareness that hadn't existed before. What happened here had become more than a legal case. It had become a lesson written in public records, bank statements, and consequences no one could ignore. The HOA didn't disappear overnight, but it was never the same. New leadership was installed under court supervision. Financial oversight became mandatory. Rules were rewritten, simplified, and, for the first time, verified against actual law. The language of authority softened, replaced by caution. Confidence was no longer enough. Proof was required. Homeowners talked openly now. About how easily they had accepted assumptions. About how signs and newsletters had felt official, even when they weren't. Many admitted they had believed ownership worked the way the HOA described simply because it was convenient. Trust, once broken, doesn't return quickly, but awareness had taken its place. As for me, I kept fishing. Not to make a point, and not out of stubbornness, but because the lake was what it had always been. Private property. Family land. A quiet place untouched by rules that never applied. Each cast felt like closure, a reminder that truth doesn't need defending forever. Once it's established, it stands on its own. People still ask if it was worth it. The stress. The years of conflict. The fallout. I tell them the same thing every time. It wasn't about winning. It was about stopping something dangerous. When organizations believe authority replaces verification, They don't just make mistakes. They create systems that punish the wrong people and protect the wrong behavior. The HOA didn't lose $8.2 million because of a fishing pole. They lost it because they ignored warnings, dismissed facts, and doubled down when they should have stopped. The call to the cops wasn't the cause. It was the symptom. What stays with me most isn't the money or the headlines. It's the moment by the dock when the officer read the deed and realized what everyone else had missed. That pause. That shift. That quiet correction. It's proof that truth doesn't shout. It waits. The lake still reflects the sky the same way it always has. Calm. Indifferent. Unimpressed by authority. And in that reflection is the simplest takeaway of all. Ownership isn't declared. It's documented. Power isn't assumed. It's earned. And when people forget the difference, the cost is always higher than they expect. This story didn't end with a cast or a courtroom. It ended with accountability. And that's something far more valuable than any lake, any fine, or any rulebook ever could be.